Lack of good power supply has always been a sore point for many Nigerians because of the impact on lives and businesses. The federal government recently announced the restructuring of 5 distribution companies, also known as discos, in the country. Now, this is following Fidelity Bank's activation of the call on the collateralised shares of Kano, Kaduna and Benin Electric distribution companies over their inability to repay loans obtained to pay for assets acquired in 2013 privatization exercise. The affected discos are the Kano Electricity Distribution Company, Kano Ibadan Electricity Distribution Company, Benin Electricity Distribution Company, Kaduna Electric, and Port Harcourt this distribution company. Now, joining us for this conversation is the legal practitioner and chairman, West Power and Gas, George Etomi. Good to see you, Mr. Etomi. Well, this doesn't sound like good news at all for Nigerians. Perhaps you could walk us through what exactly the possible consequences and implications may be if the federal government goes ahead with the restructuring of these distribution companies.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I think we need to correct a notion. It's not the federal government that's restructuring the company. It's the banks who lend money to the companies that are pushing for restructuring them. They're only
as we captured in our we captured that in our introduction.
Yes, it's important because there's this misconception as though the government was trying to take this, because it's important that the narrative is correct. It's the banks, and most of these were for the acquisition funds that the investors borrowed at the time. The principal problem here was that most of the borrowing was done in dollars, they earn in naira, and the exchange rate has moved against them so badly. At the time, most of these funds were borrowed. The naira rate was about between 150 and 190 to the dollar. Today, we're talking about something in excess of $600. There's no amount of naira you can generate that can deal with this gap. And unfortunately, discos, like many other businesses, do not have any kind of preferential access to Forex. So that is the major problem. Before today, most of the discos were pushing as part of the overall resetting of the sector for these acquisition finance to be redominated in naira. The central bank was being pushed to do that. Well, most of the banks who lent said that they themselves would have to be the ones to absorb the differential. If the CBN could make up the gap, all well and good. We don't think the CBN is willing to do that, so the investors are left to carry the can. Overall, it is not good news for not just the sector, for the overall economy. Everybody needs to brace up, especially for those who are borrowed in dollars and need to pay in naira in a system where the foreign exchange rate continues to move against investment. So this is really what's going on in the sector.
What is the implication? This is Sam Omashe. What is the implication of all of this for the discos themselves? Because it's not going to be a disco matter eventually. It's going to be the whole power architecture.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. The implications are quite dire. For over 1 year now, we've been having what I call talks to reset the entire industry, spearheaded by the central bank. And one of the issues on the table was this issue of the acquisition finance and some of the capital working requirements of these investors that it needed to be refinanced. A company like Eco Disco, for example, did their refinancing about 4 or 5 years ago. I think they saw the storm coming and quickly refinanced, took the hit at that time, but the margins at that time were much less. I think it was at the time Eco Disco refinanced, the naira had gone to 300 to the dollar. We acquired at 190. So you could say we had that foresight. That's why at this point we're not affected. But what's playing out here, it's the overall mismatch between the tariff structure in a business and the obligations we are all expected to meet up with. From the get-go, the privatization was premised upon a market-driven structure. That's the only thing that brings investment and attracts investments to the sector. But we've never seen that. It is only in the last year, 18 months, owing to pressure from COVID and the collapse in oil prices, that there was this sudden move to restructure the tariffs. But by that time, the gap was so much, tariffs were nearly doubled. And the effect of doubling the tariff was that it created a tariff shock amongst consumers. So many discos suffer from issues to do with bypassing and inability to collect as fully as they can, because there's naturally to be expected consumer resistance to the doubling of tariff without a commensurate increase in the services that should have come. So it's a pity for investors. It's not good news, because even for the banks who've taken over these assets, they still have to meet with the market obligations. Today, all disco accounts are escrowed. And in that escrow, a waterfall is created. And priority is given to VAT once a collection is made, to VAT, to loans provided by the central bank, to the banks, to market obligations, as in you pay fully 100% for the power that is delivered. And then the last in the ladder is the working capital for the discos. So for many discos, by the time all these are taken without their consent, as it were, of most of them do not have money to meet their working capital requirements. So they are forced to go and borrow. At least, thankfully, this time it's in Naira. So it's just a question of time. Now, without a tariff structure that can accommodate this, these other obligations still have to be met by the banks that are now taking it over. They are taking it over in a holding position until they get new investors. And you can take my word to the bank any day. No investor will come in if their money is going to be used to subsidize the sector. No investor invests to subsidize the sector. You invest to make money in exchange for the service you provide. So the narrative has always been, the impression has always been given that the discos are inefficient, they cannot collect, or they are taking money. That's not absolutely untrue. They're just victims of an economy that's overall been completely mismanaged. And it's going to have a ripple effect on the entire industry, like you said. For example, the reason we've not had an epileptic supply of power has nothing to do with distribution, very little to do with distribution. It's the supply end. Gas, the gas infrastructure is still not there. Gas is still being delivered to GenCos on a best endeavor basis, which means that the GenCos cannot contractually hold the gas producers. And the gas producers are telling you, I can't give you if the pricing is not right. So the gas producers look elsewhere to sell their gas. And it's when they have excess that they can give to GenCos. And the GenCos are saying that that's not giving us the desired quantity we require. So most of our turbines are shut down, and this shutdown starts and all that is creating problems for us. And so we can't deliver the enough power way too embed for onward delivery to the discos. And of course,
Mr. Etomi,
yes.
All right. I mean, these issues are really very deep. But for Nigerians, all we want is a better and improved power supply. Talk to us about the issue of power generation. Where do we stand at the moment?
Yes. I mean, we all desire. Don't forget that even for those of us in the industry, we are consumers as well, and we pay. So that's our desire. Because honestly speaking, if we get power right in this country, it will turn around our economy. But from the very beginning, having a behemoth called PHCN was never the way to go. And what that has led to has been this subsidy game, which, as we have seen in both power and the petroleum sector, is just to just put it mildly, a scam. Because what is going on right now is that you do not have numbers for anything. How much power is generated? There's quarrel over whether it's 5,000, whether the capacity is 8, or whether it's 13. But the most important thing is that even if the GenCos can generate 8,000 as it's claimed, they can only transmit less than 5 because of transmission constraints. Transmission, by the way, is still 100% federal government. Even when it now goes through all that and gets to the discos themselves have to battle with antiquated infrastructure, which they have to invest in. That requires a lot of capex. To invest in capex, if that investment is not going to be reflected in the tariffs, there's no incentive for you to do it. Otherwise, you will end up subsidizing the sector. So it's still a value chain that's plagued by liquidity crisis. And the only way you can do that is to ensure that you allow the economics of the sector determine the price. That's the only way investors will come. I have always said that the money that is required to take us out of the power quagmire is not in Nigeria. It is in hundreds of billions of dollars. It must be investable funds coming from outside of these shores that are secure and are assured that the investment climate is friendly. But when you have a subsidy regime that distorts this picture, it's going to be an uphill task. So whether it is the investors, the discos, the Nigerians have invested, some of them are going to lose hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of this decision. But I can assure you, anybody who takes over from this point is going to be plagued by the same problem. So until we sit and speak to each other and have the entire value chain speak and discuss, it's going to be very difficult. You thinking for a second how much it takes the average Nigerian to give themselves power. And this time, think about your power consumption holistically. You generate, you buy diesel, you have inverter, you have everything. By the time you compute that cost together, if it was in one tariff structure, you'll be paying, God knows, over 150 naira per kilowatt hour. But today, grid power is about 50-something, 60-something. And everybody's complaining. And yet we can do that if we were privately generating. The difference here is that if Nigerians see power, they will pay. If they don't see, they will complain.
Yeah.
So we must move to a point where we can try and harmonize this whole thing. Everywhere else, power, Ghana, Gambia, Senegal, everywhere and the tariffs are way, way higher than here. But because there is no distortion, the investment's coming. Anytime you have a distortion, no investor will invest because they will just be looking to see when that distortion will go. Today, the government is broke. So they are handing off these subsidies in the sector. The regulator is now forced to activate, let me say, partial activation of the contract-based market. Now, that market is premised on the fact that at least 5,000 megawatts of power will be delivered to discos. The GenCos have already told you, how are we going to do that when we do not control gas supply? Gas is still being delivered to us on a best endeavor basis. How can you contractually hold me to supplying 5,000 megawatts? You're owing me anyway for past power that have generated.
Yes.
So there's doing the value chain, much to talk about, but we just really need to.
Yes, some people have said that the problem with this whole power thing is at the beginning, and that when the NEPA was being dismantled and the discos and the GenCos were coming into being, that the whole system was wrong ab initio. And this is the problem of Genesis. This is the problem of the battle of the Garden of Eden in Nigerian power industry, and that we cannot solve it until we solve the original sin of not getting the GenCos and the discos right at the beginning?
Well, to be honest with you, hindsight, this is 2020 vision. All we can look at is the intention behind the privatization. The idea was that government has no business in business, so we must move and get the private sector in. And if you look at other privatizations that have taken place, banking, telecoms, aviation, there is reason to believe that that is the way to go. And I think we all agree that the more we get government out of business, the better it will be for the whole of us. Now, in the case of the power sector, it's a bit more complicated because, as I said, PHCN, as it was a behemoth. So the plan initially was to privatize the value chain, i.e. generation to transmission to distribution. But then you have a central grid. And the practical issues about privatizing a central grid was big. So there were no takers. It's not as if they didn't go out looking for investors. There were no takers. So whilst they had people who potentially looked at the generation and distribution end, there was nobody to look at for the transmission end. So the agreement was, okay, let's go look for somebody in the private sector who can then manage transmission. This was how they landed with Manitoba Hydro of Canada to help manage TCN at that time. But like me and you know, it was supposed to have been concessioned. It was a disaster. And that disaster meant that government still needed to be there. So you can imagine having government between two privatized entities. I don't need to expand about why that is a total mismatch. So it's not a question. So if you say it was gotten wrong ab initio, if you are querying the intention to privatize, I think we'll all be wrong. But if it is what the government was forced to do, well, that was what it was. But in terms of getting investors into the sectors, the Nigerians who stepped forward, it was a leap of faith on their part. And I will tell you that from the negotiations, it was always understood that the key thing to get right in this sector was a tariff structure. But like me and you know, tariff is so political. Even the government that initiated the privatization exercise, at the point where the exercise was concluded and the regulator was going to trigger off MITO to start a cost-reflective tariff, they requested the regulator to crash prices because elections were coming. That was where, if you say we went wrong, that's where the problem started. And from that point on, everybody was playing catch-up. Then the new government came in, everything was politicized. Oh, it was sold to friends, to cronies, to this. Nobody was facing the problem. If the politics, they allowed to be cloud the issue. And at that point, we had money, so they get money, voting money for subsidy. So you hear, we paid 1.3 trillion. Where did the money go to? Go find out. Where did it went to? It certainly didn't come to the retail end of the business. It is the exhaustion of that fund that finally brought all of us to the table to discuss what we should have done 7 years ago. But where we are, I am an incurable optimist. We must learn from the past and move forward.
I mean, Mr. Etomi, making this kind of revelations calls for very serious concern. This particular administration, Mr. President, had said that they were going to bring in the likes of Siemens to bring some sort of stability to the power sector. So are you saying that this was just a case of lip service by this particular administration? Or there are those who also believe that the likes of discos also make efforts to frustrate the plans of governments to improve the power sector generally?
But let me even address the last point. The only way discos make money is if they sell power. So does it make sense? How do you frustrate it? So they give you the power, you hold it until the price is right. It's not possible. Power is a wasting asset. Once you get the power, you give it out, whether or not people are paying for it. Otherwise, there's absolutely nothing you can do for it. And as I've explained to you now, the discos don't even have control the funds that are coming from the sector. As the monies are collected, it's escrowed. So it's not fair for that picture to be created about the discos. Now, with regard to the federal government effort on cement, let's get it very clear. All those efforts, the federal government is talking to cement, that's going to the World Bank. It's in recognition of this liquidity crisis that I'm talking about. So the idea was to see how they can get funds, let me say cheap funds. They're still borrowing it, it's not a gift, which they can use to shore up the sector. And the Siemens thing is still on track because that money is now being given to FGN Power, that is the special purpose vehicle that was set up. And whether that's a wise thing to do is a different kettle of fish, but that's the body that's doing it. And that body is talking to discos. The idea is to also on-lend to discos. Now, the worry that I just have is that everybody's getting money and lending to the discos. And the discos carry all these risks, and yet the matrix is not right. The matrix being the tariff structure. So it doesn't matter whether it's the current owners of the discos or new owners. We need to sit and deal with this problem. There's just no way a problem that's been with us for nearly 50 or 60 years can be solved overnight. As I said, if it's any ray of hope, don't forget that when the banking restructuring took place, a lot of the early people went in, lost their shares, and we kept tinkering and correcting ourselves until we have what we have today. Same thing with the telecoms sector. That's a little bit of a different story because the advent of the GSM technology just enabled us just sort of walk away from the landline situation, which was what NITEL was all about at that time. So telecoms is slightly different. So many investors were able to start on a greenfield operations. They brought in their technology, they brought in their personnel.
All right.
You don't have to deal with so many different things. But having said that, the overall message here is that we must push on and encourage investment into the sector. Otherwise, we're not going to go too far.
So what is the way forward? Because the way I say it now is that it is a headache for the banks. The banks have put money in there and they are trying to take charge of their own investment. But it's not a bank's business to run power. It's not their business to do. Their own is to create an atmosphere for investment and for profit. And we're not seeing that. And secondly, we have seen over the years government throw money into power, and some people got the impression that the discos, the gencos were enjoying what they call corporate welfare, and that we need to get some kind of accounting for some of these monies that the government has thrown into the sector.
Correct. With regard to the issue of the banks managing, the banks, of course, are not equipped, which is why what they did was that they have exercised their powers under the business continuity provisions of most of the loan packages they give to these companies to get in interim management. This is the reason they involved the regulator and BP, who is a contracting party, 40% of the government, and creating the wrong impression that the government is taking back the discourse. So the banks will thereafter they'll go out into the market and look for new investors. But like I told you, new is what it is. How many investors will come in and look at the picture that exists today and put in their money? If putting in their money means they have to subsidize the sector. So that's going to be a big ask when that time comes. Now, again, with regard to all the subsidy that has been put in the sector, it was inefficient. I addressed that earlier on. It was inefficient. It was not transparent. And that's why I said the problem was never tackled at the beginning. If the problem was tackled at the beginning, all that figure you hear, 600 billion, 800 billion, where did it go to? Now that we are digging deeper, we found that most of it went to the supply end, i.e. to the gas producers, because the government decides also to regulate the price of gas. So these gas producers are telling you the international price for gas is around about $7 per scuff. You're asking me to do it for $3. Who's going to do the cap and all that? That's where most of it went to, because the feedstock for most of the thermal plants, which accounts for 70% of our consumption, is gas. So there is a problem at the supply end. Now there's no more money to do that. That's why they want to activate the contracts. So the expectation is that the collections from the disco is what will go in to address all the issues in the value session. But the discos, for a long time, were being made by regulation to collect less than even the cost of the product. So from day one, there was a gap. So it is a wrong impression to think that gap, the discos don't keep the money, it's escrowed. So there's visibility of the money that the discos are collecting in the sector. Yes, it may not be full, because one of the major responsibilities of the discos is to reduce ATC and C losses. I agree. But even if they did 100% collection, which is not possible, it will not address the liquidity problem in the entire value chain, which ends up, in the case of thermal plants, with the gas. So how do you deal with gas? Now, the way forward, I think we should move towards a market where the gas producers are beginning to talk to the retail end of it, so that you have, again, less government presence. Once you interfere in a market, you will create a distortion, and that will not happen. For example, the government itself gave guarantees, partial guarantees, to two of the gas producers, RQ Gas and one of these other gas producers. And consequently, a lot of the money that was being voted for as subsidy was used to pay those ones, because the government, if you ask me, unwisely went to give them guarantees. But no such guarantees were given to existing gencos. No such guarantees were given to existing gencos, not even to the discos. So you have a too much government, and it really, if they exit and they allow the sector to talk directly to itself, then you will begin to see an alignment that will remove these distortions. And that's why I said, to give you an idea that this is possible, if you look at what it costs Nigerians to sell, there's so much, perhaps even more money, going in within self-generating cycles than even within the grid structure. Mm-hmm. But let's see how things pan out. The National Assembly, one of the last things they did was to amend the law to allow states to pass their own electricity laws and control the value chain. Let's see if that will work. But we need to get serious.
Barrister Etomi, we are winding down our conversation with you at this point, but perhaps I could just squeeze in a question or two. Can you be sincere and a bit realistic with Nigerians? When you look at the second quarter of this year, for instance, what are your projections about the power sector? The national grid has always collapsed. Nigerians are tired of waking up to that particular story, maybe every month or twice a month, as the case may be. What are your projections as regards the power sector or power outlook in the second half of the year? And just to add to that, we are in a transitional phase. 2023 is just around the corner. Perhaps you could talk to us about just how Nigerians can also play a role in improving the power sector in the country. What key leadership questions should Nigerians be asking themselves at this time as they head into 2023 as regards the power sector?
There is absolutely no doubt that power will be a major electioneering issue. and people would like to more explanations about what's happening and what's not happening. But people should also educate themselves a little better about the way the power sector works. It's a lot better than it used to be before, because before now, if the sector had not been privatized, me and you would not even have had this conversation, because there was just no pathway to understanding what was going on beyond I switch on, there's power, I praise God, it's on, I call somebody and put on my generator. But today, we all know how these various sectors, members of the value chain are interacting with one another. That's power in itself, in the sense that it begins to make me and you understand how we can go, and thus it can make us work better. Secondly, renewables. Let's not forget, the central grid structure is not working, like we can all see, where everybody generates power, take it to a central grid, and then it's then transmitted. And it doesn't really matter who is able to pay and who is not able to pay, because we have this Father Christmas attitude of making sure everybody gets power. Hopefully the legislation that's just been passed, if it's consented to, the constitutional amendment, if it's consented to by the various state governments, will take care of that. I know Lagos State, those states, some states already actively passing their own electricity laws to deal with the problem. Because if you segment the sector, balkanize it, perhaps you can address it. Three, as I told you, mini grids, renewables, part of decentralizing the grid, especially in underserved or unserved areas, will work. There's a mini grid regulation that has not fully taken off. But hopefully as we advance into the future, that will also happen. But I will give you one thing. I'm an incredible optimist. Perhaps I'm not the person to ask this question. We learn from mistakes. This privatization exercise has opened our eyes to the possibilities and the realization that what holds the key to the diversification of this economy is power. So we must do everything to ensure that the power sector works. So as we go into campaigns, into an election year, Nigerians will be able to ask more poignant questions about what these politicians, these answers they have. But for me, the more government gets out of this business, the less distortions we have, the more hope we will have that investments, both local and foreign, will come into the sector.
Well, I guess that's a fine place to anchor our conversation with you at this time. Barrister George Etomi, legal practitioner and chairman, Westgate Power and Gas. Thank you so much for speaking with GVC Breakfast at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.